By now you may have noticed that New Orleans keeps more than one timetable. There is the ordinary city, all jazz and neon and spilled drinks, and people making promises they do not intend to keep. And beneath it, beside it, or perhaps simply waiting for the right hour to overlap with it, there is another city, an entirely a patient one, a counting one. Most people never meet it properly. Tonight, a man named Charlie Boudreaux is drunk enough, lost enough, and lonely enough to mistake arrival for accident. That is often how the city prefers its introductions. The midnight parish. Things that don't like to be noticed. There are things in New Orleans that do not like to be noticed. Obscurity can be power, because attention is a kind of light, and light has a habit of making rules apply. The city wears its ghosts the way it wears humidity, close to the skin and mostly unbothered. They tuck themselves between cobblestones. They press like whispers against the levees. They linger in the space between a jazz note and the silence that follows it. You don't see them unless they want to be seen. You don't hear them unless you're already listening. And every now and then, when the night is the right kind of wrong, a streetcar arrives, as if the city had summoned it from some older obligation. It appears old as regret, patient as debt. People have names for it because people hate not naming things. They call it the midnight parish. They call it the last streetcar. They call it a rumor with wheels. It only runs at midnight. Daylight has no claim on it. It preferred stranger forms of pavement than coins or plastic, and apologies, however heartfelt, never seemed to impress it. Sometimes it brings its passengers back. More often, it doesn't. And the quiet rule people rarely say out loud, that one that lives in the back of the throat like a warning you don't want to swallow. If you board it, you are already agreeing to be counted. And every so often, it finds someone who is already halfway lost. Charlie Boudreaux was drunk and lost, which is how most ghost stories begin. He told himself that he would drink only a little. He told himself that with the honest conviction of a man who had already ordered another round. The bar off Canal Street was loud and forgiving, the kind of place where the whiskey arrives like permission, and everyone pretends tomorrow is a rumor. Charlie leaned into the noise as if it could drown out his thoughts, even though he knew better. He kept chasing the tail end of a thought he couldn't catch, something that had been nagging at him all week like a loose thread. It was the sort of thought that shows up when you're alone, when the lights go low and the world gets quiet enough to hear your own regrets shifting in their corners. He insisted he was fine because he wanted it to be true. Belief doesn't work that way. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he left it there unanswered. There were only a few people who ever called that late, and he already knew which ones he was avoiding. A voicemail he never returned, a job he quit in anger and swore he didn't care about, a woman he loved badly, the way people love when they haven't learned how to not bruise. A choice he made that seemed small at the time, the kind of choice you shrug at, the kind you forget, until it grows teeth and comes back hungry. Charlie drained his glass and stood, unsteady but determined, as if motion could solve what thinking couldn't. He wandered out into the quarter because wandering is what people do when they are hoping the city will rearrange them into someone else. The streets pulsed around him. Jazz spilled from open doors. The scent of something sweet and rotting curled through alleys like a flirtation. The streetlights flickered as though considering going out entirely. Charlie walked on, humming a tune he didn't know he knew, and then the city changed its mind about being loud. The music stopped the way a room stops when a door opens. The city holds its breath. The silence descended in stages, the noise simply thinning, slowly, unobstructively. The jazz softened as if someone had turned the volume down with careful fingers. Laughter drifted further away. Footsteps vanished. The quarter, usually so eager to be a spectacle, began to fold itself inward like a stage after the show. Charlie blinked, confused, and the confusion sobered him a fraction, which is always the most insulting kind of a sobriety. He turned his head, expecting to see revelers and tourists and couples spilling out of bars with their bright, temporary joy. He found himself alone. The street lights flickered like they were negotiating whether to keep working. One lamp buzzed softly, then steadied, as if reminded of its responsibilities. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. The air thickened, waiting, pressing against Charlie's skin like a damp hand. He could hear his own footsteps too clearly. Each step sounded like a decision. Charlie slowed. His breath came louder, harsher, the only living noise left on the street. He felt suddenly conspicuous, as if the city had emptied itself specifically to make room for him. He turned a corner, and there it was, a streetcar, old as a photograph, painted deep green, its numbers worn away by time or deliberate forgetting. Its windows were fogged from the inside, as though something warm and breathless sat within. Lantern light glowed behind the glass with the pale, steady color of old bones. Charlie stared, registering that he'd never seen such an old streetcar in service before. He was sure of that, but it was late. He was lost. It was a streetcar after all, and streetcars are supposed to be reliable even when everything else isn't. Charlie found himself bordering before he could think better of it. His feet made the decision for him. Boarding the midnight parish. Charlie climbed aboard because the alternative would have required admitting he was afraid. The steps were slick beneath his shoes, damp with the night's breath. The lantern glow inside. The streetcar pooled on the wooden floor in long, trembling strips, as if the light itself were uncertain whether it should be here. Charlie hesitated on the threshold for half a heartbeat, hand hovering near the rail. The doors shut behind him with the finality of a sentence ending, the kind of closure that doesn't invite edits. Inside, the silence was thick. The engine rumbled beneath his feet. The wheels hissed along the tracks. Charlie could feel the vibration of motion in his bones. But the sound of it was swallowed, as if the air inside the car had been trained not to carry noise. Even his breathing sounded muted, like he'd wrapped his mouth in velvet. There were passengers. They sat in rows beneath the dim overhead lamps, stiff as if they'd been posed and then forgotten to relax. Their clothes belonged to different decades, different centuries, lace collars, threadbare coats, a soldier's uniform dulled by time, a woman's hat pinned with feathers that looked too old to be trusted. They looked blank, absent-looking, as if forgotten by time and their own lives. Their eyes faced forward, hands in their laps. Their faces were arranged into expressions that suggested patience had become permanent. They might have been waiting for their shop or waiting for the concept of stopping to return to the world. At the front of the car stood the conductor. His uniform was crisp, pressed to perfection, as if he'd ironed it with devotion. His cap was pulled low, shadowing his face. Charlie could see the outline of a mouth, the pale suggestion of cheekbones, but nothing quite readable. Without asking for the streetcar fare or asking for Charlie's final destination, the conductor watched Charlie the way a clerk watches a customer approaching the counter with something fragile and unpaid. Charlie swallowed, throat suddenly dry. He forced a laugh because laughter is a flimsy shield, but it's what he had. "Where's this thing headed?" he asked, trying for casual, trying for drunk brave, trying for anything that made this feel like a normal mistake. The conductor's lips parted, inhuman, pleased. "The last stop," he said. The words slithered down Charlie's spine like a cold hand. An inevitable, unavoidable fact of fate. Charlie opened his mouth to ask what that meant. The streetcar lurched forward before he could, and outside the fogged windows, the city began to smear. The tracks leave the map. At first, Charlie told himself it was just speed. Streetcars blur the city when they move. Lights streak. Neon drags. The quarter becomes a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Charlie clung to that explanation the way a man clings to a railing when the floor shifts under him. Then the buildings bent. Bourbon Street's neon signs smeared like wet paint, and then warped into shapes that didn't belong to letters. Balconies stretched too long, ironwork curling like ribs, doorways widened as if yawning. The streets outside the windows rearranged themselves with slow, deliberate confidence, as though the city had decided to stop pretending it was bound by right angles. Charlie pressed his palm to the glass. It was cool and slightly damp. It felt like touching the surface of a held breath. The tracks, when he tried to see them, were wrong. Sometimes they multiplied, splitting into too many possibilities. Sometimes they vanished entirely, and the streetcar glided forward anyway, wheels whispering along nothing at all. The world outside began to look less like New Orleans and more like the memory of New Orleans told by someone who didn't like humans very much. Inside, the passengers remained rigid, looking straight ahead, unable to or uninterested in looking out the window. No one spoke or moved, except for the faint sway of bodies responding to motion. They sat as if obeying an unspoken rule. Do not look back. Do not speak. Do not remember. Charlie leaned toward the nearest passenger, a man in an old coat with hands folded neatly in his lap. "Hey," Charlie whispered, because whispers felt safer in that muffled air. "Do you know where we're going?" The man continued to stare straight ahead. Charlie tried again, louder. "Sir?" Unresponsive, the man remained staring. His hands were too still, Charlie realized, too perfect, as if he were a mannequin dressed in someone's past. Charlie's mouth went dry again. His gaze darted along the car, searching for any sign of human response, any flicker of discomfort that might mean he wasn't the only one aware of how wrong this was. The conductor stood at the front, unmoving, cap low, watching the rails that may or may not have existed. Charlie reached up for the cord. Every streetcar has a cord. Every streetcar gave you the illusion of control. He ran his fingers along the wall where it should have been. His fingers felt nothing. He reached again, desperately, lower, higher, along the length of the car. His fingertips found a thin line tucked into the paneling, almost hidden. Relief surged through him, quick and stupid. He yanked. Something bit him. A sharp sting, a thin slice across his finger, quick as a paper cut, and twice as insulting. He pulled back with a hiss, staring at the bead of blood that welled up bright against the lantern light. The cord was gone. Charlie's heart hammered. His pulse felt loud in his ears. The only sound in a world determined to swallow everything else. Charlie licked the blood off his finger without thinking, tasted metal, tasted panic, and in that small, bitter moment, he understood what the quiet had been doing. That he was drunk and lost mattered not at all. This streetcar, this midnight parish, was about being collected. The veiled woman boards. The streetcar slowed with a shudder that Charlie felt in his teeth, without the usual announcement or overhead chime. The conductor did not turn. The passengers continued to stare straight ahead. The car simply decelerated as if it had reached a destination the world had agreed not to name. Outside the fogged windows there was a stop, but it was wrong. The signposts were the wrong shape, the wrong height, the wrong kind of metal, like it had been borrowed from a different century and never properly returned. The doors sighed open. Cold seeped in, not air cold, but the cold of deep water, the kind that makes your thoughts slow down and your instincts speak louder. A woman stepped aboard. She wore a veil as black as an oil-slicked river, and the fabric drank the lantern light rather than reflecting it. The veil moved with the faintest, gentle sway, as if it had its own opinion about gravity. Her beauty was not the sharp, living sort that made people stare. It was softer than that, a memory of beauty, something worn at the edges by time, made more dangerous by how calmly it endured. She boarded without paying a fare or exchanging words with the conductor. Instead, she looked directly at Charlie. The streetcar's thick silence tightened, as if even the air wanted to hear what happened next. The woman's mouth curved slightly, knowingly, into a smile that felt like recognition. Charlie went still. She was a stranger to his memory, but not to something deeper. Her gaze found him with the terrible intimacy of someone reading the parts of him he kept hidden, even from himself. And with that gaze on him, something in Charlie shifted. The memories he'd been holding at arm's length came forward at last. The voicemail he saved for 3 years, just to hear a dead man say his name. The pair of cufflinks he stole back after the breakup. The fish he forgot in the freezer until the power went out and the whole apartment smelled like consequence. Regret rose in him like a chain lifting off the bottom of a river. He felt the shape of his own life as an unfinished sentence, the kind you start confidently and then trail off because you've realized you don't know how to end it without admitting the truth. The streetcar had been waiting for him, for the hour when he would be tired enough lost enough and heavy enough with his own mistakes to mistake invitation for fate and step aboard a vehicle from the city beneath the city. The woman in black held his gaze and smiled, as if she'd known this would happen all along. Charlie's pulse stumbled. She looked at him the way a blade might look at rust, with recognition and no mercy. In that gaze, he felt himself laid bare. Not tragic or misunderstood, just smaller and meaner than the man he preferred to imagine himself to be. Not tonight. Charlie didn't notice the movement at first. His attention had been captured by the woman in black the way a hand captures a throat, gently, completely without apology. But something shifted at the far end of the streetcar, a change in the air more than in the light, and Charlie's eyes snapped toward it with the startled reflex of prey. A man sat near the back of the car, one arm slung casually over the seat back as if he were waiting for a friend to arrive late. Unlike the others, he was not staring forward. He was watching Charlie, eyes intent and curious, and with a certain fond familiarity, as if he'd seen this pattern enough times to know how it usually ended. Charlie knew they'd never met, but he knew his name anyway. The city delivers names like prophecy, and the streetcar, apparently, was not above gossip. Lucien Devereux looked absurdly composed for a man sitting on a haunted streetcar that ate mistakes for supper. Ginger beard, impeccably trimmed, hair neat despite the damp, wrong air, Victorian attire, pressed as if time itself had been politely instructed not to wrinkle him. He wore his calm like armor, and he wore his manners like a blade kept sharp. Lucien leaned forward slightly, meeting Charlie's wide eyes with a steady gaze that suggested he had already judged the situation and found it tiresome. Then, in the softest voice, he said, "Not tonight." The streetcar shrieked, although the sound didn't come from the wheels. It seemed to come from the car itself, a sound like old wood protesting and something beneath it snarling. The passengers snapped their heads toward Lucien in perfect unison, as if yanked by invisible strings. Their eyes were empty and endless, the kind of gaze that doesn't see people so much as count them. The conductor stiffened at the front, cap still low, posture suddenly sharp. Lucien lifted an eyebrow mildly, as if the streetcar theatrics were silly. "You have enough souls for one night, don't you?" he asked, voice polite, almost conversational. The conductor did not answer. Lucien glanced at the passengers, then back to the front, and sighed like a man addressing an overexcited child at a dinner party. "Must you be greedy in public?" he asked, as if greed were a breach of etiquette rather than a cosmic appetite. He adjusted his cuff with careful fingers, as though the apocalypse had been rude enough to wrinkle his sleeve. "Midnight," Lucien murmured, almost to himself. So predictable. The streetcar's silence thickened. The lamps flickered, and for a moment Charlie thought the light might simply give up. Then came the pause, the long, strained pause of a negotiation happening without words. Lucien held still, calm as a signature. At last the conductor exhaled. It sounded like a tired clerk closing a ledger, and Charlie understood, with a dizzy jolt of relief and terror, that Lucien had done something far more dangerous than shouting. He had reminded the streetcar that rules existed. The break and the bargain. The conductor stood very still. If he had been human, Charlie might have called it hesitation, but there was nothing human in that rigid patience. It was the stillness of a system waiting to be told what to do. The stillness of a rulebook deciding whether it liked the person holding it. Lucien held his gaze on the front of the car, calm as a signature drawing on paper. For a long moment, the only movement came from the lantern light trembling overhead, and the faint sway of the passengers, heads still turned toward Lucien, as if their necks had forgotten how to look forward. Then the conductor tipped his cap. It was a small gesture, almost courteous, the way a clerk might acknowledge a customer with seniority. Reluctant respect, unhappy compliance. The kind of politeness that says, fine, but only because you asked correctly. The conductor's hand moved to the brake and pulled. The streetcar shuddered like an animal forced to kneel. Metal screamed. Wood groaned. The entire car buckled as if resisting, and Charlie felt a pressure shift in the air, like the moment right before a storm breaks. The passengers' bodies rocked in unison, stiff and obedient, but their gaze remained on Lucien with a patience that felt worse than hunger, as if appetite had learned discipline. Seemingly uninterested or unimpressed by the other passengers, Lucien kept his eyes on Charlie, intent, focused, devoid of apparent sympathy. Kindness makes people linger, and lingering is how you get collected. Go, Lucien said, voice low, precise. Don't make me repeat myself. Charlie's hands trembled. As he stood, his knees felt reluctant, even his body, which had finally gotten the message that this was real, begged him to remain seated and quiet like the others. He forced himself forward. As he moved towards the doors, something in him was taken, a clean, precise subtraction, the sort of toll existence collects from men who escaped too much for too long. He tried to swallow and found the whiskey hollowed out. The heat was still there. The burn was still there, but the flavor had been lifted away as neatly as a coin palmed from a distracted hand. Maybe it had never been the whiskey. Maybe it was his last easy courage slipping free. Either way, the absence landed in him like a missing tooth. The doors opened, and the quarter's noise rushed in like oxygen. Return to the living city. Charlie stumbled onto the curb and sucked in a breath that tasted like sweat and beer and gasoline and life. The street was loud again. Neon hummed. Jazz spilled from an open doorway. Laughter rang out with the casual cruelty of normality. A couple walked past, shoulders brushing, arguing affectionately about where to get food, and neither of them looked at Charlie the way people look at a man who just crawled out of the mouth of something ancient. To them, he was just another drunk. To Charlie, the whole world felt newly fragile. He turned, wild-eyed, expecting to see the streetcar behind him, doors yawning, passengers watching, the conductor waiting for the next count. But there was nothing. The streetcar was gone, and with it the otherworldly tracks, the fogged windows, the eerie lantern glow, even the lingering scent of old wood and silence. All that remained was an empty stretch of street and the ordinary lie of night air, warm and damp and innocent, the kind of air that made you want to cry simply because it wasn't trying to hurt you. Charlie's hand shook harder now that he was safe enough to feel it. He looked down at his fingers, at the small smear of grease from the streetcar's railing, proof that it had been real, and he tried to breathe through the pounding of his heart. Across the street, Lucien was already walking away, coat neat, posture composed, as if he had other disasters scheduled and didn't care to be late. Charlie opened his mouth to call after him, but no sound came out. Lucien Devereux did not look back. The veiled woman watches. At the end of the street, under a street lamp that flickered like a nervous eyelid, the veiled woman stood watching. Her veil moved gently in the night breeze, black as oil on water, drinking the light. She felt like a fixed point in a city that loved shifting its furniture. Charlie felt his pulse climb into his throat. He tried to speak. He wanted to thank her, to curse her, to ask who she was, to demand why she had looked at him like that, but the words stayed lodged behind his teeth, heavy and useless. Her face remained expressionless, even as her gaze held him for one quiet beat longer, the way a teacher holds a student's eyes when the lesson has been delivered and there will be no retake. Then she was gone, as quickly and inexplicably as the streetcar. Some nights offer second chances, others only offer delays. And in New Orleans, transportation is rarely just transportation. The city will let you stumble away, but it will remember your stop. Midnight remains, patient in the dark, learning the shape of your weakness. It changes routes to meet you. Charlie Boudreaux had been returned, which is not the same thing as being spared. Some doors in the city do not close behind you. They simply learn your name and wait for midnight to come round again.